Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Change on the Run podcast, where we discuss common change challenges and ways you can address them when you're short of time. And I'm your host, Phil Buckley. Today's topic is changing your culture. All big changes require some form of culture change. This requires modifying how people think, interact, and behave. And the challenge in doing so is that these traits are deep-rooted, difficult to alter, and even more difficult to sustain. So how do you change an organization's culture so that it aligns with and enables a culture initiative? And my guest today is Glain Roberts-McCabe. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Phil. Great to be here.
Thanks for being on. And Glain, I don't know if you know this, but I first saw you many, many years ago when you led Micah's open enrollment leadership training business. And I was running the training and development practice for the Business Development Bank in downtown Toronto. And I attended one of your classes, and you were introducing the person that was going to be presenting. And my colleague that was with me leaned over as you're talking, and I can see it right now, and said, "That's Glain. She's someone to watch. She's a mover and a shaker." And I, it's funny what you remember in your career, but I never forgot that intro into you. And it's so true. You continue to be a mover and a shaker.
I feel like you need to give me the name of that person so I can send them a thank you check.
So Glain is a group peer coaching expert, team and executive coach, keynote speaker, and author. She is the founder and the president of the Roundtable that offers award-winning group coaching and mentoring programs that help leaders navigate growth, disruption, and change. And Glain is also the author of 2 books, Did I Really Sign Up for This? Leadership Truths to Help You Survive and Thrive, and The Grassroots Leadership Revolution, Build a Peer Coaching Community and Own Your Career, that published in May. Glain, what's your experience when you're trying to change a culture to support change?
That's such a great question. And again, thanks for having me on the show to talk about one of my favorite topics of all time. So as you shared, the Roundtable, we're all about behavior change. And so behavior change can happen at a personal level, but it also happens at the larger corporate level. When we talk about corporate culture, what we're actually talking about is the collective behaviors that we've all agreed to follow here in this company. And so what I've learned, and this maybe is not going to be a very happy story for a lot of HR leaders out there, is that corporate culture really does start with the CEO and their views and their motivators and their biases, and how that then starts to take hold and take shape within a company. And so I think one of the things we often see organizations doing is they'll try and do these, ground up change initiatives where we're going to change the culture and let's get every frontline employee involved in defining what the culture is going to be. But ultimately, it is the actions and beliefs of the person at the very top of the house that will start to shift the culture subtly, or in some cases not so subtly. I mean, we can look down to our friends in the US to see the subtle shift in culture in a country as a result of a change in leadership power, right? And it's no different in our organizations. So that's probably one of the biggest things I've learned about corporate culture, is that it's still, at the end of the day, can come down to one individual at the top of the food chain, so to speak.
So true. I'd agree as well. And I'm not sure if you found this, but have you ever had the situation where the leader, the top person, and let's say, her sort of immediate direct reports, and they bought into a culture change. We're all going to be agile or whatever it is that they want to do. And they can talk the talk, but the behaviors that they exhibit to everyone in the organization is diametrically opposed. Have you ever faced something like that?
I think that's quite common. I think often leaders don't recognize their own impact. I mean, leadership in itself is an inside out job. So I think too often, it's one thing to know what you need to do as a leader. It's a very different thing to actually do what you need to do as a leader. And so I think intellectually, yes, a lot of senior executives will sit around and they'll hear, we need to be more innovative, we need to be more agile. But if they don't have the deep self-awareness to understand how their collective energy either aligns to that vision or actually is counter to that vision, it's going to be difficult. So I can think of a very specific example of a group that we worked with a couple of years ago now. And it was interesting because they were in a sector where they were kind of bringing in a new concept into Canada, and they needed to be very innovative. So the strategic plan had a very big innovation bent to it. And we were going to be this innovative organization, and we're going to be changing things up in our sector. And when we worked with the executive team, and one of the tools that I use, which I love because it gets into this motivational energy, right? And this is intrinsic motivational energy that we all have as individuals. So when we looked at the map of this executive team, one of the motivators that really maps high to innovation is a motivation called creating. So how much energy do you get from imagining new ideas and that sort of improvisational aspect? And what's sort of balanced to that is leaders who are also kind of low on things like structure and stability. Like that's not a big driver for them. They don't need to know the whole plan. When we did the executive team, the only person, and the person who was driving this innovation agenda was the CEO. He was the only individual on the team that had a lot of energy for this kind of direction. The rest of the executive team, who intellectually would say, yes, we need to innovate, were much more operational type of leaders. They were much more about the plan and having a clear pathway. And meanwhile, he was wanting to test and trial, and why aren't we moving faster? So he was really frustrated with his direct reports. And from a collective energy, they were so loaded in that other direction that below them, everything was more about policy and let's put in this procedure and let's make sure that these pieces are in place. And so I think that's what senior leaders often underestimate, is that they don't recognize their own biases, because this individual, that was also his bias. I mean, it's he wanted to move that fast. Should he have? I don't know. That's not really for my place to judge, but that was where he wanted to take the company. The rest of the leadership team weren't on that same, path with him. And so it created this friction within the team itself. And so when you work with teams, in our team coaching practice, and when we're working with teams around culture, one of the biggest things is to help them understand that and to see how they're either aligned or not to the vision they're trying to create. And then it comes down to then how do I need to change as an individual in order to really support this vision? If we all buy into that this is where we have to go, then it comes down to what are the behaviors I'm going to need to demonstrate to drive the actions to get us to the results we're looking for. Right. I really loved the book, Change the Culture, Change the Game. It's a terrific book because it really sort of lays out this pyramid of, our experiences create our beliefs, which drive our actions, which lead to our results. And as individuals, we have our own experiences, creates our belief system, drives our actions, get our results. And executive teams have a set of beliefs that drive their actions, that drive the results that they get. And so anyway, that's sort of my observation of teams, is underestimating their own power in either supporting culture change initiatives or actually getting in the way of it.
And I'm wondering, in that example, let's say that there was a behavior that, let's say, was more extroverted, it's innovation, the energizing, but this operationally, preferred group have probably never expressed that before. How do you take someone and help them adopt a behavior that might not be at all aligned with, what has made them successful in the past and their preferences?
Oh, yes, the behavior change question. I mean, this is the part that is always tricky. And it's particularly tricky when you're talking about executive teams that really are driving the culture, or really any team leader. You can be the head of marketing within your organization, or maybe you're the senior manager and you've got a team below you. As Marshall Goldsmith, my mentor, would say, what got you here won't get you there.
Perfect.
And the piece about this, which is so critically true, is that once you get to a certain stage of your career, your strength also is your liability. Like you can't separate those two things. And what happens is your strength is your liability because you overuse the strength in certain situations. So that leader who is that very, I mean, I can put myself in this camp. I am a very high creating leader, you know, who likes the innovation, who likes to try new things, that drives that all the time. That is where I will go to if given my druthers. But the reality of in my business, in order to scale my business, in order for me to have people on my team who can deliver my programs, I have to standardize things. I have to stop innovating on things. I have to create a platform. So what do I have to do? That's not where I want to put my energy. I don't like things standard. I like to change things up. So one of the things that we have to do with leaders is we have to look at, first of all, what's the need of the business? What's the strategy that's being driven? What's the role you're playing within the business? What's the circumstance you're leading in? So situationally, green team, experienced team, what's going on? When you pull those filters through, and then yourself as an individual, what are your motivators? Where do you get energy and it's natural, and where don't you? We take a look at all of those factors, and then what we help a leader pinpoint is what's the big bang for the buck. This is what we call it, the big bang for the buck behavior, that if you got a little better at that, it's going to be a game changer for you. What I know, Phil, which is what I think most people think, and I get pushback on this all the time, they'll say, yes, but I'm my authentic self and this is how I am. And I always say, yeah, but you know what? There's two sides to your job. There's what you need to do and how you need to do it. And if we need you to be more structured, or we need you to be more innovative, that's part of your job. And to say, well, that's just not me, I don't care. You have to be that way. So what we're trying to do is help people get very specific and make those little behavior changes. And what I've learned over time is you actually don't need to do that much. It's actually not as much as you're thinking. So a lot of people think they have to become some radically different person, when in fact they don't. They just need to know how to move the needle a little bit to increase their impact. So that's what we spend in our leadership practice. We spend a lot of time with leaders, helping them with the behavior. In our culture practice, we're spending a lot of time with senior leaders, not only defining the culture they want to create, but then helping them as individuals who are going to be the stewards of the culture and the owners of the culture figure out, okay, so what do I need to lean into here?
Well, what's the role of the leader in culture change?
Well, I mean, they have to role model it. They have to be the ones that are walking around, showing to everybody else in the organization that things are going to be different around here. So if you are a leader who's saying we need more agility in our organization, we need people to take more risks, we need to do more things. One of my curious questions is, okay, so how do you celebrate failure around here? And as a senior executive team, how open are you with the rest of the organization on failure? Or is it that in this organization, we talk about innovation, but I remember that last guy. I remember when Phil used to work here and Phil did that thing and Phil didn't do well. And then all of a sudden, Phil wasn't on the hypo grid anymore. Phil was looking for a new job. Like that is what happens, right? Like experience, create our beliefs that drive our actions that lead to our results. So what we have to do as with leaders is say, what are the beliefs that exist in this organization? What are the beliefs that we hold in this organization around innovation and risk taking? So I always think, like when we're working with leaders on their development, you can't change 50 behaviors. You're not going to boil the ocean. So that's why we get to the big bang for the buck behavior. We're saying incrementally, if you can make a change on this, it's going to have a big impact. I have come to believe that it is the same for an organization. Organizational leadership, one of your biggest roles is to boil it down to, if we were to do one thing here in this culture, if we were to shift this culture, the needle in this culture in one direction, what would be the big bang for the buck behavior? I've got a client right now that they've had a change in leadership at the CEO level. The prior CEO was very hub and spoke. Everybody had to come to that individual for decision making. The new CEO is much more egalitarian, wants everybody to have accountability and responsibility. You think that would be easy? That's not easy. That's 25 years of an ingrained behavior in a culture that's around somebody else is going to be making the decision, not me. And so what the one big bang for the buck behavior for that organization is, frankly, the behavior to have courageous conversations. It's to have the conversations where people are comfortable pushing back and saying, is this what we want to do? Because before, if you did that, well, the CEO is going to override you, or the CEO is going to do what they were going to do anyway. So I think that's the thing that, as leaders, and if we're stepping into teams, we see an issue with the team, we see something, pick the one thing. There might be 30, but pick the one thing that if you could get that moving, it's probably going to affect other things. So courageous conversations impacts accountability, it impacts decision making, it impacts communication, and all of those things start to get impacted, but you're focusing your message and you're keeping it simple for everybody, and you're driving everybody in the same direction.
Say if you're working with a client and you look at their values, and let's say the values that they say they have, they really have, because there's some great examples of fantastic businesses that truly do live the way that they believe they should, which is amazing.
Yeah.
So how do you leverage those values, assuming that they're great, when the organization has to make a pretty big transformation or a disruption, as you're talking about? How do you leverage those assets so that you can help people kind of get to that next spot in their careers and the business?
Yeah, I think the thing with core values, when a company has really solid core values that they're really embodying, they're not just words on a wall, but they're really embodied in the culture. The thing about that is they don't really change. What you're talking about is you're saying we need to pivot our business and we now need to go in this direction. And I think what organizations then should be doing is, I think sometimes there's a knee jerk say, well, maybe now we need new values, or we need to do things. It's not so much that, but I think what you have to start to step back and look at is what a good exercise for all organizations is actually to rank your values. What's number one? What's number two? What's number three? Because actually what values are is a decision-making tool. What overrides the other? And I'll give a picture of that. Like at Mica, the company you mentioned, we had 4 very core values. And one of them was entrepreneurial spirit. So act like an owner. And the other was customer first. And I can remember having a situation where we had not delivered for a customer. And I was really upset about it. My client was really upset about it. And I went into the CEO and the CFO and I said, I'm going to write this off. This is $100,000. I'm going to write it off. We did not deliver. And they both freaked out. They were like, you can't do that. This is ridiculous. Da, 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 da. And in that moment, and I had a real back and forth with them, because the entrepreneurial spirit value was overriding the customer first value. And that was how we would make decisions there. And so we ended up having at our management team meeting a very robust discussion about this. And it was a really important discussion, because really at the core, we were saying customer first, but we were acting entrepreneurial spirit first. And I think when you are in an organization, you have to be really clear of our core values. How would we rank them? Like if we're making decisions, what is the most driving one? And then when there's a change that's coming up, let's relook at our values again. Do we need to re-rank order them based on where we're going? Do we need to dial up more emphasis on one for this period of time? Or do we need to introduce something new because we've done such a big pivot that we actually need to introduce something new into the mix that we want to emphasize? Because if you think about any company, all values exist within any company, because we're a collection of individuals. Individuals have different values. All values exist within any company. It's what you're choosing to amplify when you put those words on the wall. What you're saying is, out of all these values that are floating around in here, we're putting an emphasis on these 5, right? And so it's a tool to drive alignment. That's what culture is to me. It's really this tool of driving alignment. And I think as leaders, we need to recognize that situationally, the world is dynamic, our business is dynamic, our executive team is dynamic. And so to revisit it on a regular as a tool that supports our strategy is where we have to connect those dots.
With some organizations I worked with, the last time they talked about the behaviors that would demonstrate and or machinations of what that value was 10 years old. So even getting people to talk about, well, now, and this is where we're going, well, what behaviors are appropriate? Have you seen that as well?
Yeah, for sure. I think one of the things that organizations spend too much time on are things like competency models. And so I'll go into organizations sometimes and they've got a list of values, and then they've got all these leadership competencies. And the first thing I do is look to see the correlation between the two. And it's never a pretty picture. It's never an easy mapping. It's never clear. It's almost like, there was some consulting firm that went in and said, okay, you need to have these competencies, and nobody connected the dots. And then when you get into competency models, my biggest beef with leadership competency models is they're always a mishmash of knowledge, skills, and sometimes behavior. And the behavior definitions get really ambiguous. So you'll get, we want leaders to demonstrate executive presence. And I always say, what the hell does that mean? Same as when you say we need leaders to be strategic. What does that mean? What does that actually mean? Tell me what they're going to be saying and doing that's different than what they're saying and doing now. And so I really do feel like we overcomplicate things. And I think it's, maybe people with too much time on their hands or looking for pet projects. But I mean, to me, I think if you've got a good, solid value system that's well defined by behaviors, that can last you for years and years and years with this lens of, let's look at this through, what's the strategy that's in front of us right now? What's the role we're asking leaders to play? What's the circumstance they're leading in? What tweaks do we need to make to that? And get it behaviorally anchored. Most competency models are not behaviorally anchored in terms of leadership behaviors that you want to see demonstrated. Sometimes in the HR space or in the talent space, we get accused of flavor of the month. And I don't think it's wrong. I think, I think people think that they need to keep refreshing things and changing things. Whereas I've learned that, repetition and, in change, it's probably change 101 for you, right? It's just communication and repetition of the communication. And it always takes longer than you think. So I do feel that that's one of the challenges we face is we get overcomplicated.
Oh, I hear you. And it's funny you mentioned competency models. And what I find with my clients is that there's a massive transformation, finance transformation. And then someone from HR will say, well, we needed a new competency model. And my first reflection is, well, what was wrong with the old one? Well, no one used it. Well, I think we've got an idea here. And it's almost like a brand manager who comes on to a new brand or they've just been hired. And the first thing they do is they change the packaging. And you say, well, was there anything wrong with the old packaging? Well, I don't know, but I do know how to change it.
We're just working with a client right now who wants their managers to get better at giving behavioral coaching. And my colleague and I were looking at their very well written, behavior, their competency model that they've got 10 things with 4 bullet points under each section, so that's how many bits of data that you're trying to absorb as a line leader. And yet, when it comes to behavior, the tricky behavior work that gets done is like things like somebody who has a very sourpuss look on their face in meetings. Like I got a guy right now, he just looks like he's angry all the time. He's not, but that's how he looks in meetings. That's a behavioral challenge for him because he intimidates people. His boss thinks he's difficult to work with as a result. Well, there's no competency model in their organization that says competency, be approachable or be seen as nice, but yet that's the thing that's limiting his behavior. So I think we use these tools. I think they're okay as maybe a starting point, but the reality is behavior is subtle and it's tricky to change, and it's often about the norms that exist within the broader organization that we have to pay attention to. And for every individual, like for that individual, that's a very specific targeted focus area that he needs to work on, right?
No,
so
absolutely.
Yeah.
And how about with the whole it's culture is so nuanced and the norms are there and they blend together. When you are going in and helping a leadership team change their culture to achieve their goals, are there elements of the existing culture that you have to respect in order to go forward? What's your experience there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you always want to sort of look at that. One of the things we'll do with teams is sort of help them really define their purpose. Most teams have mission and vision statements, but they don't have like a team purpose statement. And team purpose is so important because when you have a team purpose, then you can really anchor into the way that team is going to work together. And then that really helps you understand and see, within the culture, what are the aspects of this cultural story that are going to be easy for this team to maintain, and which are the ones that they're really going to have to pay attention to because they are biased in a certain direction? Like I have a team right now that are phenomenal results oriented, and they have a culture of results, and they have a culture of just working hard and driving forward. And as a result, what I would say is people are afraid to fail because they're so performance based, and there's a tendency, frankly, to have like that huge appetite, because they're also a very optimistic, and the energy of the leadership team, this leadership team, like right now, the pandemic is like, come on, let's go. Like it's another mountain to conquer, and how are we going to get these results in this particular time? And so for them, that's great. But below, when you start getting below and you look at what that starts to create underneath in the organization, that's the part that it's not so much that, and that's the hard thing with all of us, right? Like when I was saying earlier about as individuals, we have that strength that becomes liability. And the hard thing about it is that you don't want to water down your strength. But what you have to do is you have to balance out the liability. How do you do that? Well, you introduce a new behavior that softens the edge of that overused strength. So in the case of this team, which is extremely driven and results oriented, one of the places they put less attention on is recognition and appreciation, because they're moving fast. It's not the muscle they use the most, but that as a muscle to start to balance out the drive, what have you done for me lately, kind of subconscious approach they bring, by being super intentional and super conscious about making recognition and appreciation at the forefront. They can still drive results, but they're bringing in this other behavior that they tend to ignore. And so that's what we do with individual leaders, but that's also what we do with teams, is figure out, okay, where the part of the culture that you want to keep and retain that's working well, how do we do that? But the chance is, if that's working that well, you're probably overusing it, and the gap that you're feeling is probably somehow attached to that. So how do you get intentional? And that's like, we have a little leadership model, and the center of the leadership model for us is be intentional. Get really specific on how you need to show up, and what are the things in this organization, what are the stories that we want to start amplifying to start to shift the beliefs that people have about what it's like to work here. Because that's what you really need to get at. Like, a lot of people want to change the result, like we want people to be more accountable or whatever, but what you got to actually get under is, how do you tell different stories, and how do you start amplifying people who are demonstrating different behaviors, so that people start going, oh, okay, wait, it is different around here.
No, that's beautiful. I love it. And I'm wondering, there's one thing to start changing a culture and, profiling people, and people are doing things and with different behavior. But there also can potentially be that elasticity effect, where if you don't have the focus and they don't have the support of you and your team, they can kind of atrophy or spring back to the old culture. Any advice on how you sustain the culture change, so it's just not, okay, these 3 months we were trying the new culture, but then the old one seeps back in? And
it's kind of like we hear that all the time with like leaders, right? They were good for a while, and then they went back to their old habits, right?
I know a few.
yeah. And so like the thing like that's really where you come back to that energy piece, because what I would say to any leader, whatever is your biggest development opportunity. So for me, the low structure piece, I've been low structure my entire career. What I have to do to make that not be a derailer for me is I have to make structure a no-brainer. So people who work with me today, when I say to people that I'm low structure, people laugh. They go, "You are not. You're like one of the most structured people I know," because I have all these structured programs and structured this and structured that. But that's because I've had to put that in place in order for me to really work with my strengths. And so it's the same with a leadership team. They have to, like, so for this leadership team where recognition isn't their go-to, the thing that they have to do is build it into structures and processes. They have to have at their town hall. We open every town hall with an appreciation. If you value something and you want to make it happen, guess what? You better have a daily checklist on whether or not you did that behavior, or it's not going to stick. Like what we make all of our leaders do is we call it the daily top 5. Intentionally, 5 things you're going to do today. It's the same within a team. You have to look at your communication cadence, your one-with-one cadence, all of those things, and say, with intentionality, where do I need to put this behavior? Because if I don't get intentional about it, I'm not going to do it because I don't have energy to do it. It's going to fall off my radar, but I know it's important. And I know for us to get to this, to us to deliver on this strategy and for us to deliver on this, we're going to have to do that. And I think the other thing, Phil, that really occurs to me as we're talking is you also have to look at the mix within the team. And invariably, when you look at a team and you look at the energy of a team, if I go back to that example I used of the team where there was the CEO who was the real innovator and the rest of the team were more operationally focused. What would happen is he didn't have anybody else to play off his energy. And so the rest of the group almost would shut him down, or they'd give him lip service and they wouldn't push back, but then they'd go off and do their own thing, and it drove him bananas. I mean, when we were looking at, he had an open position, and I talked to him about, you need somebody who's going to bring more of this energy into your team. And so I think we have to also be really thoughtful about making sure we've got diversity. Like, we talk about diversity in so many ways. I think diversity of energy is really important. And then I think when you've got that diversity of energy, how do you tap into that? What I noticed is a lot of groups, you can go through all the hiring, but it's fascinating to me, all the executive teams I've worked with, it's an 80-20 rule where 80%, they clump around 80% alignment, but the 20% that there's difference, that's the stuff that'll get you into trouble in certain things, right? So if you've got a team that leans more towards results and driving results, it's going to look one way. My team leans more towards people and helping and all that stuff. That gets us into a whole host of other problems, right? We're not billing for things we should bill for. We're overextending ourselves. We're being way too collaborative and then slow on decision making. And so when you're aware of that, though, that's where your energy goes, you can be very intentional about saying, okay, guys, we're being way too collaborative. We got to move forward and get a decision going.
Wow, that is great.
And you can create a culture where you're just talking about that stuff like it's not a big deal and it's not against a person. It's about we have a collective responsibility here to own this, right?
Wow.
And a collective responsibility to hear that voice.
I'm wondering, in terms of culture change, you brought into an organization, there's no time. It'd be great if you could have workshops and, breakouts, and maybe it's a rescue, maybe just you've got to go quickly. What's that one thing or the one action you'd have that leadership team do that would give you the 80% results in the 20% of the time?
Yeah, such a good question. I think the thing that I would get them to do is I would get them to think about what are the beliefs we hold here in this organization, and what are the beliefs that are really enabling our results, and what are the beliefs that are getting in the way of the results. And often that awareness, when people start sharing the stories that they believe exist in an organization, it really gets to the heart of the culture that they've created. And then they can decide, okay, if there was one belief that we wanted to change here, what would we want to change it to? And how do we start to amplify the stories of people who are, demonstrating that? So if we want to create a more innovative, because we have a belief that if you innovate here, you're going to fail and you're going to get fired. Okay, so how do we start ourselves demonstrating vulnerability and failure and get that going? And then how do we start to find some places to have small failure and incrementally build our muscle in this area, if that's what we want to do?
It's a great response. But just for the listeners, when they're faced with culture change, is there one tip from the expert to say, hey, this is just one thing I want to leave you with?
I think just be, as leaders, that if you're listening to this and you're a leader, know that you are creating culture. I don't care if you're leading a team of 2 or you're leading an entire organization, whatever level you're at, you control the culture of your team. So being really clear with yourself and then engaging your team to really be intentional about what is the culture we want to create. So come up with those working agreements. How are you going to treat each other? How are you going to support each other? That is you getting very intentional about your team. Do not think culture just resides in the HR department down the hall. It does not. It lives with you. And so that's what I would just remind everybody. They create culture.
Thanks, Glain, so much for being on the show. It's been amazing. How do people get in contact with you? How would you like them to connect?
Yeah, so they can find me at our website, which is goroundtable.com, and they can certainly track me down on LinkedIn, Glain, like shine, Glain, Glain Roberts-McCabe on LinkedIn.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being on the show. I really appreciate it.
It was a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Oh, great. Thank you. And I also like to thank our producer, Charlie Buckley. And thanks to you for listening. And if you have any questions or comments, please email me at phil@changewithconfidence.com. And for upcoming episodes, please subscribe to your favorite platform. And if you have a minute, please tell someone about the show if you think it would be of benefit. So until the next time, I wish you all the best as you continue to lead change.